I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Captain William J. Toti, U.S. Navy retired. He's a speaker, an author, and a consultant. I apologize, I made a mistake when I invited him for a Tuesday. I have his bio. I should not have invited him for a Tuesday. I should have had him Monday and come back Tuesday and come back Wednesday and come back Thursday and come back Friday and have him do every night of that week. And we might have gotten through a small part of his extremely interesting career. Next time we invite him back, it's going to be for a whole week. And I apologize for his brief presentation today. But he's quite a fellow. He was born in Youngstown, Ohio, Naval Academy graduate, a 26-year Navy career. He told me that, I didn't realize this, you don't get to count your Naval Academy years as part of your Navy. I mean, I would think that's even harder than the Navy, so you ought to count 2 for 1, but anyway. So Naval Academy graduate, 26-year naval career, many assignments in the Navy. They include, towards the end of his career, the commanding officer of the USS Indianapolis nuclear attack submarine, former Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3, former Commander of the Fleet Anti-Submarine Warfare Command, former Senior Executive with several defense contractors, culminating with his service as CEO of the Spartan Corporation, which is a defense manufacturing company that focuses on maritime and naval systems. And after leaving all of that, he wrote a book, From CO to CEO, a practical guide for transitioning from military to industry leadership. He's spoken on this topic all over. He's written articles on all sorts of subjects, ranging from the Indianapolis to defense policy to defense contracting, that have appeared in the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs magazine, and other publications. He was recognized as the author of the year in 2000 by the U.S. Naval Institute. Maybe you saw Crimson Tide with a submarine show with Denzel Washington a long time ago. He saw it and met a screen. He was an advisor to that, and he met the screenwriter, and they partnered up, and they wrote a screenplay which was to follow up on Crimson Tide, and the subject of it was an Islamic terrorist takes over a nuclear submarine and what happens. And that screenplay was a semifinalist in the 2001 Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences screenwriting contest. And I said, good grief, what in the world beat you? Because I want to go home to Netflix and rent it. And he said it was something called like Amal and the Bees or some crazy thing that was a total flop. And I'm outraged. He also, you think, well, he's lived a full life, and yet there is more. He published a book of photographs, and he's had his photographs appear in other books. He's appeared in numerous documentaries on the Indianapolis and other subjects on PBS, the History Channel, Fox, and the National Geographic. And he's the co-host of a podcast with another fellow, The Unauthorized History of the Pacific War, which you can watch on YouTube and listen to on Apple Podcasts. Also, he was on active duty at the Pentagon at the time of the September 11th attack, and he was awarded his 3rd Legion of Merit for his actions during and following the attack. He wrote about his actions and what happened, and his narrative became a part of the 2006 Random House book, Operation Homecoming. So this is my introduction, but I'm going to add a little bit to it from someone else. One of our group who comes is Joseph G. Garrett, a retired Army Major General living in Asheville, and he drives down for these lectures, and he's unable to be with us today. But he wrote me this email, and I just want to read you what he said. He said that he had met Captain Toti before. He says, this is his email. I have met Captain Toti previously and have also read his book and several other accounts about the sinking of the USS Indianapolis and the court-martial of its captain. In my view, Captain Toti's persistence and perseverance almost single-handedly was responsible for the eventual favorable determination on the case of Captain McVeigh. I would also note that Captain Toti's efforts were undertaken at peril to his own career, and his moral courage to do the right thing was exemplary, especially in the face of so many who wanted the case left untouched. I know it will be a good luncheon. I know it too, and I'm proud to welcome you to our stage.
I don't know what I can say after that introduction, Bob, so thank you so much. Sounds like I've lived a long time, and I have. I've had a very blessed life. I talk about that a lot. You could not ask for a better Navy career, a better industry career, and a better life in general than I have had, and I'm just so proud and thankful for the opportunity to speak to you today. I take anytime anybody asks me to talk about our World War II, Navy, I focus on Navy, forgive me for that, Navy heroes. I never shy away. Doesn't matter where I need to go, what I need to do. These guys need to be remembered. I specialize in one particular ship, but I also have a general understanding from, as Bob said, our podcast, which my partner's an actual historian from the National World War II Museum, New Orleans. He left that job a couple of years ago, and he and I decided to do this podcast just because we were bored. Figured we'd do it a couple of months. Nobody would watch, and a year and a half later, we're just 5 million views. And so we're so proud that people care about this story, that people care about World War II, because frankly, we didn't think that would happen. Today, we're going to talk about a tiny microcosm of the larger World War II framework, and it is about the Indianapolis. I was first asked to speak about this in 2017 after the ship was rediscovered at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. So I put this together. It's evolved over time, but that's kind of this bit of the story. Now, hopefully, my little setup here will work, and so we're going to try and see. I'm going to skip the Jaws thing because the audio is not working, but there's a clip in Jaws that you all remember where the shark hunter named Quint talks about why he's trying to kill the shark in Jaws. In fact, Quint is played by a man by the name of Robert Shaw. The very great privilege of meeting Robert Shaw's son last September, on September 11th, oddly enough, in New York. He was doing a play about the making of Jaws, about his father, where he plays his father. And he looks just like his father, and they recreate that scene on the boat. And it was just so remarkable. And I don't think Shaw's son understood the full impact of this movie, because the story of the Indianapolis was not in the American conscience. A book had been written, published in 1958. And then in 1975, when this movie came out, I was a plebe at the Academy, played almost for an entire year at the Circle Theater in Annapolis. I know I went and saw it a handful of times. When this movie came out, nobody knew about the story, didn't know it was true. In fact, I didn't know if it was true or not. I had to ask my history of sea power professor, who co-wrote our textbook with Admiral Nimitz, if you can believe that, whether it was true or not, and we learned it was. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indianapolis. The word that comes to mind every time I talk about this ship and her crew is pathos. That's just, it's a gripping story. It's one of these things where if somebody wrote it up as fiction, you would say it was contrived. There's no way this could possibly have happened. This would be one of these fictional stories nobody would believe. But it happened, right? And then I'm going to talk about some myths that have emerged in the decades since the movie Jaws came out, some of them caused by the movie, and others just emerged since then. And so, the story of the ship. It was a Portland-class cruiser, 1,196 men, huge crew, required a lot of men to operate those boilers. You had 4 engine rooms, four sets of boilers, 4 propulsion plants, 4 screws, and of course every one of the guns was manually operated, and it had a lot of guns. It had 8-inch guns, 3 triple turrets of 8-inch guns, but it had a lot of 5-inch guns as well, and 44 millimeter Bofors and 20 millimeter anti-air guns. So it needed human beings to operate, multiple human beings for every one. So it was a huge crew. It was the Admiral Franklin Roosevelt's ship of state early in his presidency, which means back in the days before Air Force One, when he traveled the world, he would ride the Indianapolis. It was a flagship of the Fifth Fleet during World War II. It was Admiral Spruance's flagship. So it was a storage ship commissioned in 1930. And so when it was sunk, I'm not going to, spoiler alert, it was sunk, right, 1945. It wasn't that old. It was only, 15 years old when it was sunk. And so it was sunk by a submarine, obviously, Japanese submarine I-58. The commanding officer of this submarine, Muchisura Hashimoto, had been torpedo officer on I-26 during the attack on Pearl Harbor. So he was there. They didn't sink anything there. In fact, he went through his entire World War II career without ever sinking a ship until July 30th, 1945, when he just chanced upon the Indianapolis. That was the first ship he ever got to sink. So he had 6 Kai-10, which were suicide torpedoes, on the boat, but he came home after the war was over without the Kai-10, which caused some people to think he used the Kai-10 on the Indianapolis, but he claims he didn't, and after we found the ship in 2017, we can confirm he was telling the truth. He shot those poor 6 sailors at some other ship and got no kills with them, because this is the only ship he ever sank. The captain, Charles Butler McVeigh, his dad is 3rd generation Navy officer, Naval Academy graduate. His dad was a 4-star commander of the Asiatic Fleet going into World War II, Academy grad, 2nd generation U.S. Naval Academy grad. He received a Silver Star while he was XO of USS Cleveland for the battles of Kula Gulf and Kula during the New Georgia campaign. I have podcasts on those battles if you're ever interested in learning about them. They're fascinating stories. And earned a Bronze Star while CO of the Indianapolis during the Battle of Okinawa. There's a sad story, poignant story about that. If I remember to tell it, I'll tell it. Took command of the Indianapolis in November of 44. Now, believe it or not, guys only remained in command of these ships for 6 to 8 months on average during the war. They were operating at such a high tempo, and they were under such great stress that after about 6 or 8 months, they'd rotate the COs off because they would start wilting. Submarine COs, you got 5 patrols, and then you were gone. And many of them didn't last the 5 patrols. They either died, it was the highest fatality rate during the war of any warfare specialty in the war, or they just couldn't take it, and they were rotated off. But McVeigh was well respected, well thought of. He'd been the chairman of the Intelligence Committee of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which is the combined United States, United Kingdom, Royal Navies, or joint forces, not just navies. And so that was his job. He was essentially the J2 for the JCS before he went to command. Remember, in those days, we didn't have intel specialists. There were secondary duties, collateral duties, at least in the Navy. And of course, famously court-martialed after his ship was sunk and committed suicide on November 6, 1968. I got to know both of his sons before they died. I got to know many of the people who testified at the court-martial. We'll talk a little bit about that. But again, a really sad story. So setting the stage. In March of 45, kamikaze hit. It was during the Battle of Okinawa with Admiral Spruance aboard. It was the flagship of the entire formation, the entire fleet, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Army Air Forces, all commanded from this ship by Admiral Spruance, okay? And they get hit by a kamikaze. Actually, before the landings began, they get hit by a kamikaze. The kamikaze put a big hole through the hull, through the bottom of the hull, in the engine room. Only great seamanship kept this ship from sinking. So they were able to counterflood and keep it from capsizing, and they had to seal the compartments. They sealed 9 guys inside the compartments who died in those compartments. They lost 9 sailors. But through great seamanship, they were able to keep the ship afloat, pull into an island off of Okinawa, put some temporary repairs, and then limp back to Mare Island. Obviously, Spruance cross-decked off of the Indianapolis so he could continue the battle. But limped back to Mare Island, happened to be in Mare Island that was March of 45. July of 45, the United States needs a vessel of opportunity to transport the Hiroshima bomb. This was the only uranium bomb that we had. Remember, we had not tested the uranium weapon, but we're pretty sure it would work. But they needed a ship of opportunity transported to Tinian so we could load it up and drop it on Hiroshima. Indianapolis just happened to be finishing its repairs. It was available. It was selected. It transported, actually broke a speed record for crossing the Pacific, arrived in Tinian on the 26th of July, delivered its cargo, then steamed to Guam, which is only about 100 miles away from Tinian, for orders. It was expected to go to the Philippines, to Leyte, do a workup, because they had not worked up, because they were ordered to leave immediately after they were ready to get underway. But they were going to meet Spruance in Manila, pick him up again, and that was the ship that they were going to command the landings for the invasion of Japan from. So that's the background. So they depart for Guam on the 20th of July. After midnight on the 30th of July, they're about halfway between Guam and Leyte. It's kind of dark, kind of cloudy. The clouds come and go. They had been zigzagging all day. When the clouds cover the moon, McVeigh says you could stop zigzagging. There's a lot of second guessing going on here, as you can imagine. But the point is that we're trying to preserve fuel for the invasion of Japan. And so there'd been a speed limit of 16 knots in the Western Pacific to preserve fuel. To zigzag and get to Leyte in the time that he was ordered to get there, he had to travel 23 knots. So he said, we might as well slow down and go straight. Nobody could see us. There's no moon. The moon's behind the clouds. So he gave the officer deck, steam a straight course while it's dark, resume zigzagging if you need to, but never got to do that because the cloud uncovered the moon for just enough time. I-58 was there at periscope, actually it was surface to begin with, quickly got to periscope depth, launched their attack. We're talking about no more than 10 minutes from beginning to end. 6 torpedoes spread. 2 of them strike the ship. The ship goes down in 12 minutes. So there's about 1,200 guys on board. 900, 300 or so went down with the ship. 900 make it into the water. After they're rescued, 316 are still alive. It just so happens that Wilbur Gwynn was flying an anti-submarine war patrol in a PV-1 Ventura, happened upon them, happened to see them, which is even more remarkable, and the sequence of events which leads him to happen to see them, unbelievable. All of this is unbelievable. He radios in the clear against orders for help. Adrian Marks in his PBY comes, lands on open ocean, starts picking up survivors, realizes he's completely, nobody knows who these people are in the water, of course, until Adrian Marks lands in the open ocean, radios, we got hundreds of guys here, you need to send ships. I can't pick them all up. Ships converge. One of those ships is commanded by Lieutenant Commander Graham Claytor, later Secretary of the Navy, Graham Claytor, who signed my commission when I was commissioned in 1979, cousin of McVeigh's wife. You can't make this stuff up. I'm going to say that over and over again. You can't make this stuff up. And so after 5 days in the water, 316 survived. They decided to court-martial McVeigh because he hadn't been zigzagging. What? The only commanding officer ever to be court-martialed after his ship was lost due to an act of war. It never happened before, never happened since. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of books about why Secretary of the Navy, everybody blames this on Admiral King. It was actually not Admiral King's decision. Admiral King was CNO. Secretary of the Navy Forrestal made the decision to do this. A lot of speculation as to why. Remember, Admiral Forrestal ends up committing suicide himself a few years later. So the bottom line is it happens. One of the guys called to testify is this submarine Commodore, Glenn Donahoe. He says it wouldn't have mattered if the ship was zigzagging. That's what the spread of 6 torpedoes is for. One or more of those torpedoes going to hit. Glenn Donahoe, by the way, is a Commodore Submarine Squadron 3. Fast forward 35 years, I'm the Commodore Submarine Squadron 3. And when all this is going down, my involvement in all of this is happening, you can't make this stuff up, folks. The other guy they call in to testify against this heroic American captain is the commanding officer of the Japanese submarine. Again, never happened before. We've never called an enemy combatant in to testify against an American hero. Never before, never since. And what did the enemy submarine CO say? It wouldn't have mattered if the ship was zigzagging. I shot a spread of torpedoes, 6 torpedoes, one of them was going to hit. Okay, and so both submariners, their testimony probably helped the defense more than the prosecution. Doesn't matter. The way that naval regulation is written, if you could have done something and you didn't do it and you're the captain of the ship, you're culpable. So the court-martial had no choice but to convict. That's the bit that the survivors didn't understand until they actually shanghaied me into their effort to exonerate their captain. So I served 3 tours on the submarine Indianapolis. I wanted to serve on the Indianapolis as a junior officer because of the cruiser, because I knew the story of the cruiser. And so I actually asked to transfer off of the USS Omaha so I could and go on deployment right after I was married. My wife will never let me forget this. So that I could transfer to the Indianapolis because I knew that was such a heroic name of a ship. Omaha, Indianapolis, that's the ship I want to be in. I was later navigator on the same ship and later sent to command it. I'm the only guy that I know of that served 3 tours on the same ship. And so that was my job. At the end of my tour, my command tour, the Russians, the Soviet Union had collapsed. President Clinton declared peace is breaking over all over the world, that we'll never need submarines again. We're going to cash in our peace dividend and decommission perfectly good submarines halfway through their life. So I was ordered to decommission my USS Indianapolis 18 years into its 35-year life. And so we did. But I decided that because the World War II cruiser survivors, who I kind of got to know a little bit at this point during my command tour, never had an opportunity to decommission their ship, I would invite them to come to the decommissioning of mine, but on one condition. I told them, you're going to have to stand in formation with my crew during the decommissioning, and we're going to decommission my submarine together. And so they did, shockingly, and in Pearl Harbor, right? So 35 of these guys end up coming to Hawaii. Their youngest are in their 70s, and standing with my crew in formation. Again, it's just so heartwarming. It's just such a wonderful experience. And as we decommission the submarine. So that's great until the reception after the decommissioning ceremony to these guys. I have arrows pointed at them here. Glenn Morgan on the left, Paul Murphy on the right. I'm going to be telling a story about Glenn Morgan tonight. That's the guy I'm talking to, one of the guys I'm going to be talking about tonight. They buttonhole me. Commander Toti, you have an obligation as a captain of the USS Indianapolis. I was the 10th and final captain of the submarine Indianapolis, to do something for the 10th and final sub-captain of the cruiser Indianapolis. You have a moral obligation. Yeah, so guilt somebody, will you? Because I knew the story. I mean, I read the books that had been written to this point. I didn't know what I could do. The court-martial was corrupt. Once the decision to court-martial them happened, as I said, you're captain, you're culpable. There's no gray areas about this, right? This isn't civilian law here. Title 10 of the United States, statute and the responsibilities of a commanding officer of a naval vessel. You're responsible for everything that happens on that ship, whether you could have stopped it or not. The issue was, should they have brought it to court-martial? Once they do, there's no choice but to convict. But what am I going to say? World War II heroes, these guys spent 5 days in the water. I'm going to say, oh, it's too hard? Nothing's too hard, right? I can't do that. So I said, okay. And, in truth, I was a submarine captain, right? I'm the first post-World War II submarine captain to look at the problem. So, go back to the court-martial record. By the way, I was able to, years later, after all this is done, I get a call from the son of the prosecutor in the court-martial, who has his dad's notes from the court-martial. And we're talking 2016 time frame when I get the notes to the prosecution. And when I'm doing this is 1999. And I hate jumping around like that, but the point I'm going to make here is what I thought I knew in 99 turned out to be not only correct, but provable by the notes we found in 2016, the court-martial prosecutor's notes. So, he was convicted for hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. The only way to say this was an unfair conviction is that if I can demonstrate that he did, by not zigzagging, he hadn't hazarded his vessel. That's the kind of logical flow, right? And in order to do that, you've got to prove that the torpedoes were going to hit no matter what. If I can prove the torpedoes were going to hit no matter what, well, that's what the defense argued. In fact, that's what the two submariners in 1945 said. What can I do in 1999 different than what they did? Well, what I could do was computer modeling, okay? They didn't have that capability. So I was decommissioning my submarine, but I still had our torpedo computers. So what I did was set up the zigzag patterns in my torpedo computers and just run what we call Monte Carlo analysis and run 100, 115 of these different zigzag patterns with the torpedo attack pattern that Hashimoto, the spread that Hashimoto sent. And basically, I was able to demonstrate not hand-waving opinions, but quantitatively that it wouldn't have mattered if he'd been zigzagging or not. One or more torpedo would have hit. And that's, again, as the guy said in 1945, that's the whole point of firing a spread of torpedoes. But again, what I did was kind of able to prove it through modeling. So I published an article in 1999 in Naval Institute Proceedings magazine. That's not the one that got me the Author of the Year award, interestingly, but called "They Were Sinking the Indianapolis and the Responsibility Command." And in 2000, Congress passed a resolution exonerating McVeigh. So two sons, one was Charles Butler McVeigh IV, we called him Quattro for short, and the other one was Chemo McVeigh, who lived in Hawaii. Chemo gets prostate cancer and dies right before this happens, right before so he was gung-ho on making sure that this got done, but he dies of prostate cancer before I could tell him that I'd entered the exoneration language in his dad's service record. So, and in fact, the reason I entered the exoneration language is once the exoneration passed Congress and President Clinton signed it, President Clinton's Secretary of the Navy, Danzig, refused to allow us to enter it in the service record. and the president didn't care enough to order him to do it. So George W. Bush gets elected, new Secretary of Navy, Gordon England. The survivors start a letter writing campaign. You got to do this. You got to do this. And not only do you got to do this, but if Toti doesn't tell us that it's done, we're not going to believe you lying Navy guys. Some words to the effect, right? And so I got to enter the exoneration language. England actually didn't know much about the story, which is sad, right, for the Secretary of the Navy. So he called me in and said, "What's the story?" I happened to be transferred during this time to the staff of the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, and so I was in the Pentagon, and England called me in, and I told him the story, and he said, "It's about a bunch of old men who want to be told that it's not their fault their ship had sunk." And I said, "Hallelujah, somebody gets it. It's fantastic." "Yes." And he said, "Do it." And so we did. Great. So that's the end of the story, kind of. Over the decades, I was later elected to be chairman of the USS Indianapolis Legacy Organization. And what that means is, when I first started getting involved with the survivors, there were almost 200 of the 316 that were rescued in August 1945. So over the course of the time, obviously the number of survivors dwindled. When I was first involved with them, most of the guys who were still alive in the late 90s had been in their mid-20s or younger when the ship went down. The older guys had died, right, over the years, 1945 to 1999. And so the guys that I knew were younger, and many of them didn't know a lot about their own ship. Many of them got on board. They replaced a third of the crew in Mare Island before that last underway, which was pretty typical after a long maintenance period. So many of them, their only underway was when they got sunk. They didn't know much about the ship at all, so they kept pulling me in, asking me to speak and teach them about their ship over the decades. And so I got more and more involved with the survivors organization. I ended up on their board of directors. As the survivors' number dwindled, we said this story can't go away. We decided to create something called a legacy organization to kind of pick up the burden from the survivors organization. As we stand here today, there's only one survivor left, Harold Bray of Benicia, California. He's 97 years old. And so the survivors organization essentially doesn't exist, but we're trying to do with the legacy organization what we've done with the survivors were doing when they were more vigorous. And so because of that, I get involved in answering a lot of questions with the press. And a lot of the questions I get asked are stupid. They're created out of this mythology. And so every time I talk to a group of military folks, I want to make sure you all understand the truth and what's the myth is. So one of the things that have been said for decades is when Adrian Marks landed that PBY in the open ocean, that's the first time it had ever been done. And it isn't. A PBY landed on the open ocean to rescue 10 sailors during the Guadalcanal campaign. The USS Juno was sunk. You may remember that ship. 5 Sullivan brothers. All 5 brothers died when that ship was sunk, right? And so there had been several instances, maybe many instances. So that's one of the myths. And it's a silly myth. What's the point? The guy heroically landed his airplane in open ocean. We don't need to make stuff up to make it sound more heroic. The second thing, Jaws created a bunch of myths. It's wonderful that Steven Spielberg did this, but they didn't have the internet in those days. And there was only one book published about the tragedy when the movie was made. And so the mission was so secret, no SOS was ever sent. Quint says that, not true. The secret part of the mission ended after they dropped off the atomic bomb. They didn't even list us as overdue for a week. They never listed them as overdue. Nobody knew they were missing. And there's a bunch of stories that add to the heartache, to the pathos that we could go into, but don't have time. Didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. They were sunk at just past midnight. It was dark. Nobody saw any sharks until the next day, until the sun came up. And the whole bit about the sharks, has been overplayed. Yes, Sharks were there. Yes, sharks bit guys, but most of the shark damage was to the cadavers. Guys had already died. Sharks went after those. It's not less pleasant. It's still horrific, but you'll hear many people say sharks killed everybody who died in the water, and that's just simply not true. Many of the guys that died in the water were burned badly from the torpedo and the fires and went into the water severely injured and died from those injuries. So they give the wrong date. June 29th is what he says, and it was actually July 30th. There's a lot of material out there. It says 317 survivors died. That we didn't figure out the actual number until 2016. Turns out the luckiest guy in the Navy got off the ship in Pearl Harbor when they were fueled, but they never took him off the manifest. So the survivors always believed that 317 went down. In fact, the Navy sent to his mother a telegram saying your son has been is missing in action, lost at sea. And her son was in the house eating dinner when she got the telegram. Luckiest guy in the Navy. So the real number is 316. Talked about the sharks. McVeigh court-martial. There's various theories about why McVeigh was court-martial that hover around the fact that Fleet Admiral King, when he was a lieutenant, got placed on report when Captain McVeigh's father was the 4-star commander of the Asiatic Fleet. It's all fiction. It's all made up, so that's not why. Let's see. This is very common. McVeigh, the survivors told this story a lot. McVeigh requested but was denied an escort. He didn't ask for an escort. His own testimony says he never asked for an escort. But that's one of those things where we don't need more things to blame the Navy for. The Navy screwed up so bad in this incident. We don't need to make stuff up to blame them over. Many of the survivors used to love to tell a story about watching the flag go up on Iwo Jima, and it breaks my heart to say this, but they were 200 miles away refueling. When the flag went up on Iwo Jima, certainly when they came back, they saw the flag there, but they didn't see it going up. This next rumor was started by the guy who wrote Run Silent, Run Deep. I got to know him later in life. His name is Ed Beach, and in the foreword to Hashimoto's book called Sunk, that Hashimoto wrote in 1955, in the English version of it, he says he doesn't believe Hashimoto's story, that he believes that Hashimoto used Kaiten to sink the Indianapolis. So that's where that rumor started from. We found the ship. He used torpedoes. All right, SOS received by the Navy personnel ashore but was ignored. Not true. In order for it to be true, 3 different radio receiving stations separated by hundreds of miles. Sailors would have had colluded to falsify the radio logs without knowing that each other was doing it. It's not conceivable. It's just not credible that happened, because the deck logs do not show any receipt, the radio logs. And the next one, McVeigh was holding a toy soldier or sailor, different variations. Sadly, this one was started, I think, by my friend Doug Stanton, who wrote the book In Harm's Way about the Indianapolis. I have the police record of McVeigh's suicide. I have the photographs. They're not pleasant to look at. There's no toy sailor. There's no report of a toy sailor. There's none of that's true. And I told Doug that it's not true, and he won't change the book because it's a good story. McVeigh was not court-martialed for having his ship sunk. He was court-martialed for having his ship sunk. This is one of the things that I believed and wrote in my 1999 article. It was confirmed when we got the prosecutor's notes in 2016. In fact, indeed, it said we're going to court-martial him because his ship was sunk. And in this horrible, horrible movie called USS Indianapolis, Men of Courage, Nicolas Cage movie, don't watch the thing. It's all fiction. There was a ship named Indianapolis that sunk. That's the only thing that's true in the movie. At the end of the movie, they have McVeigh go out and Hashimoto meet, and they salute each other. Never happened, never would have happened. It's egregious to me and insulting to me that they make stuff up like that. So that's that. One last thing I want to say, and I can't get off without talking about the men, right? The 316 guys that the 200 or so of the 316 that I got to know, these guys were Depression-era kids. They joined the Navy. Many of them had nothing. 3 meals a day was a big deal for them. For some of them, it was the first time they had a new set of clothes in their lives, right? These kids, and they were, had tough lives before they joined the Navy. And so maybe their fortitude, their stamina was sufficient to keep them surviving. Who knows what would happen if something like this happened to people today, whether young people today, and I don't want to denigrate young people. This isn't anti-Gen Z. I'm just saying it was a different group, a different time, and people had to go through a lot of hardship and tragedy as a normal course of life. I think I talked a lot about that, about the fact that they had been young guys when I knew them. Immediately after the rescue, this is kind of interesting for me on a human evolution standpoint. You talk to them, or you see early videos or narratives that they wrote, interviews, 100% of them credited their survival with salvation from God. It's one old saying that there's no atheists in foxholes. The 316 out of the 1,200 survived, credited God for their salvation. One of them went as far as to, make ministry his life's work. And he said, over the course of the years from 45 to when I got to know them, many of them fell away from that. They fell into alcoholism. They fell into, the PTSD got a hold of them. And when I knew them, many of them still couldn't talk about it. And those who did talk about it would only talk about it with certain people. A shared experience, kind of. If you were a veteran, they would talk about it to me or to each other. But they wouldn't talk about it to their family members, things like that. It's incredible that those kinds of things happen. And one of the guys who's the final surviving Marine died in 2020, named Edgar Harrell, whose son is a minister, said that the most surprising thing to him growing old with these guys is how so many of them were survived and so few of them were saved. And that whole dynamic really, it didn't hit me as hard when I first heard him say it, but over the decades I've thought about that and thought about, what PTSD does to you, in essence, right? How it destroys you from the inside out, something these guys would never talk about. And so this became a drama, this whole story of the Indianapolis. Every time they wanted people to know about it, but they would only talk about it once a year, many of them, when they got together, the reunions. I started going to the reunions in 1999, and I went to them until there weren't any more reunions, because there aren't any of them left. But they were heroes, every one of them. And again, as I said when I started, every chance I get to talk about it, I talk about it because they're worth it. And it's really important for us to not forget their story. And so thank you for being interested in it. Thank you for listening to me today. And just never forget these great heroes. Thank you.